All right, I am gonna get us started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Seeing our attendees trickle in, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Noor. I am the coordinator of Digital Defenders, which is a program at the Women's March. We focus on online networks. We know that online networks have become hotly contested ground for influencing culture and politics. Increasingly, we're seeing public narratives and the ideas of facts themselves being shaped by peer-to-peer exchanges on social networks. In our program, Digital Defenders, we have built a cohort of online campaigners that seek to transform the public narrative on civic engagement on platforms like Facebook and Twitter, as well as Instagram, to see how we can shift public opinion, but also reach people that might be in the middle, that want some real information about how to talk to other folks in their communities or strangers around issues like climate or reproductive justice or racism and policing. So through our work with that, we're delighted to be presenting this webinar with the good folks over at Media Matters through the Women's March Network, C3. And today we're really going to be thinking about what misinformation is. We know that we're in a moment of global crisis through thinking about COVID-19 and how we seek information about what the right thing is to do in this moment of a pandemic, but also starting to dig into how conversations are happening around protests that are currently rolling through the country and bringing a lot of new and old activists together and really changing the narrative and changing legislation around policing in this country. So with that, I'm really delighted to introduce Pam Vogel and Sharon Can from Media Matters. And Pam, I'll let you introduce yourself and turn it over to Sharon.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Pam Vogel. I've been at Media Matters since 2015. I'm currently co-lead our research department as a research director, along with Sharon, who we'll talk in a second. And basically what we do is track conservative misinformation across the board and respond to it on a daily basis with a variety of different tactics. I have been, as I mentioned, at Media Matters since 2015. I started as an education policy director when we had a dedicated program for just education stuff, and that's where my background is, in education policy and in sociology. And some of my other research interests and sort of specializations at Media Matters have been primarily the coverage of gender and sexual violence, as well as local news, and especially Sinclair Broadcast Group. So for those people who are familiar with Sinclair, they are my personal enemies. And I'm happy to talk about Sinclair for a long time if anyone asks me, but local news is another big specialty for mine. And I'll turn it over to Sharon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon. Like Pam said, I also have been at Media Matters since 2015. I originally started in our abortion rights and reproductive health program, where I was until earlier this year when I moved over to the research department to co-lead with Pam. I think in terms of research interests, I'm a little all over the place. I obviously am still really interested in abortion rights and reproductive health, and am waiting with bated breath to see what the Supreme Court decision is going to be on several of those cases still outstanding. But when I'm not doing that, I'm usually the one trying to troubleshoot when spreadsheets break. And I do a lot of thinking about disinformation, misinformation, and particularly how different social media platforms play a role in that, or kind of enable the spread of those things. And that's pretty much my day to day. But we talked a little bit about sort of what we do overall as an organization, but we're really excited to talk with you all about misinformation in times of crisis.
Thank you so much, Pam and Sharon. So the first question is a broad one. Tell us about Media Matters. What do you all do? What are the different facets of your work? And I know we know a little bit about your roles, but if you could speak a little bit more to the research that you all are involved in from a day-to-day basis, that would be awesome.
Sure. So Media Matters has been around for over a decade now, and our mission is to monitor and correct conservative misinformation in the news media. So many people are familiar with us for the work we do around Fox News, but that is by far not all that we're covering every day. We have folks who are watching pretty much every hour of Fox News, but we also have people who are tracking the ways that misinformation that privileges conservative talking points is showing up in other parts of the media landscape. And honestly, that's some of the work that I find even more exciting. So we have people that are checking to see, for example, how some more like mainstream sources, like your nightly news, your local news, like I mentioned, Sinclair, my favorite, how stuff could be also spreading from actors where you might not be exactly expecting it as much as you would tuning into Fox News. And that also goes for social media, which I think Sharon can probably speak to a little bit more. But I think especially since 2016, more and more of our work has been dedicated to not just going after what's on Fox, even though that's also very important since we know the president is watching, but also how those lies are seeping into other parts of the news landscape that people are exposed to every single day.
Definitely. The thing that I would add to that just on the social media piece is I think we're going to talk a little bit more about specific examples of coverage, but something to sort of frame that discussion when thinking about platforms is that, you know, a lot of the information that we see on social media isn't something that is neutral. It's something that has a point of view, and it's something that even if the person it's sharing it with you is someone you trust, you know, there's just so much information out there that I think a lot of our job is not just identifying when conservative narratives are showing up in places where either the outlets should know better or should be doing a better job to spread accurate information, but it's also thinking about ways that structurally a lot of these platforms are set up to either enable or encourage sometimes the spread of these lies.
So to talk a little bit more about what our day-to-day work is like, obviously we again have a huge pool of people in the organization who are doing live monitoring, essentially, not just cable, not just Fox, but also local radio, conservative radio, like Rush Limbaugh, for example. We have folks that are checking up specific segments of social media. We have people who are primarily monitoring places like Reddit or message boards, where some more like fringe right-wing action might be happening. We really have people across the board monitoring most of what you would expect when you think of the words news media. Anywhere that you could be getting information, theoretically, we want it covered. And then our department specifically, we lead a team of researchers who are all generalists and are ready to respond to whatever the news of the day is, but also often have specializations either in specific issue areas or topics or stories, or specific areas of the media that they focus on, whether that's mainstream news, whether that's like radio, like I mentioned, local broadcast news, the whole gamut. So a lot of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis is sort of assessing what the big narratives of the day are, especially because those narratives are often coming from Fox News, and we know that that's what gets picked up by the right and sometimes by the president himself. It is actually a good way to anticipate what stories might be popping up in other parts of the news. And then we are thinking through, either for mainstream examples, how can we provide journalists with more information so that they can do their jobs effectively, and that they can provide information to their public that is accurate and is also as free of bias as possible. So it could even be pointing them in the right direction for who to talk to for quotes. For example, if you're covering a protest, you should probably get a quote from the organizers and not just like a random person on the ground, or not just like the police presence or something like that. So that is what we think about when we're talking about what we would call like mainstream sources. And then on the right, we're thinking about, is there anything that is 100% inaccurate? And then beyond that, what is the bias and decision-making process behind what's covered or what's not covered, as well as how they cover it? So once we kind of identify those questions, we're thinking about what information can we compile for ourselves in our research, and how can we disseminate it in a way that will help our audience at Media Matters, so primarily through our website, but also on social as well, and working behind the scenes with people in the media business. What information can we provide to improve that coverage?
Thank you, Pam and Sharon. And I made a note to, towards the end of our conversation, I will ask you to give us some tips about how you take care of yourselves, knowing that you are monitoring so many different sources. So just think about that, because I think that folks will be interested in, you know, how you take in all that information and are able to still sleep at night. So ruminate on that a little bit. But I wanted to move us into talking about misinformation generally. What does the term mean? How do you define it? How does Media Matters define it? And how do other people talk about misinformation as well?
Sure. I think I'm going to try to change slides. We made this deck. We'll see how much we end up using it, because I actually think this is more fun to kind of have as a conversation. So we'll see what happens with these. But I think by way of sort of introduction, we did want to put some definitions up here about just sort of general ways of thinking about misinformation in some related terms. There's a lot of like specifics that we could get into, but I think that these sort of as the general constructs are useful for thinking about different examples that you might see. And I'm sure especially just thinking about how people interact with the news, or how people try to kind of make sense of the numerous stories a day that have been our news cycle for a while now. These are kind of the general categories that we would suggest. So misinformation and disinformation we put up here because they can, people tend to use them interchangeably, but they're actually kind of significantly different. The big difference between misinformation and disinformation lies in sort of the intentionality. So misinformation is the spread of an inaccurate or misleading claim, but not intentionally. So this would be something like, you know, on Facebook, for example, if you copy and paste the status that's like, you must copy and paste this, or else Facebook will like have access to all of your photos and location information, which, spoiler alert, they already do. But that might be an example of misinformation because it's not a true claim. You probably aren't intending to spread misinformation when you share it, but at the same time, it is not accurate. Disinformation, sort of the flip side of that then, is intentionally false misinformation. It's usually spread with the intention, obviously, of misleading people. There's, I don't want to say always a malicious intent, but I think a lot of what we've seen borne out is that there is a motivation involved, and usually that is not the public's best interest at mind. I think an example of this beyond, you know, the sort of classic, you know, 2016 Russia, what was sort of the role of social media platform stuff that gets brought up a lot when people are talking about disinformation would be something like we've seen examples of on Facebook, or even honestly in print occasionally, there will be what get called sort of fake news websites that purport to be representing a local community or purport to be of the community, and in fact are run by an entirely separate entity. So we'll see examples of, you know, Facebook pages that claim to be like Michigan local news and are in fact run by someone in Pennsylvania or not in the US. Disinformation, the sort of core difference is just that somebody is trying to kind of make a point, whereas misinformation, it's not as intentional. The last sort of definition we threw up here is media bias. We raise this just because I think it's important, and like Pam mentioned, something that we're trying to be cognizant of is how, you know, the decisions that are being made about what is covered or what information is included in something is important when you're sort of making a media criticism or just trying to be a consumer of media information. So media bias, I think it's important to point out that bias isn't an inherently bad thing. We all have biases. The important thing is being critical about how those biases shape kind of the coverage that we, you know, as Media Matters or an institution as an institution with the force of power behind that are telling. So the other thing then that sort of fits within these categories that we'll talk about via examples later on is that fake news, conspiracy theories, all the sort of different flavors of misinformation and disinformation all kind of fit within this. But the big thing to remember, I think, is that the role of intention and sort of thinking about why a story is being told the way it is are kind of the core things there.
Thank you. Pam, do you have anything to add to that?
I lost the video for a second, so I think I'm going to go with no and assume that Sharon covered everything, which I'm sure she did.
She was thorough, so appreciate that that distinction, Sharon. I hadn't seen it split up this way, and I also think that the intentionality of disinformation, is important to name. So appreciate that. So I wanted to move us into talking about some examples of misinformation that you're seeing right now, right? Like we're seeing more and more people. I was reading that naturally with folks being, quarantined in some places, staying at home across the world, that there has been, a significant uptick in internet usage naturally, whether that is I was reading that Facebook messages, the messenger function has reported like record high usage, especially on an international basis. We're seeing more and more people spend a ton of time on Twitter. They've also reported an uptick in the number of new accounts. So I wanted to talk about and sort of ground us in the moment we're in with a pandemic, with hundreds and thousands of people taking to the streets every day. So let's start with COVID-19. What are some examples that both of you and Media Matters has seen pop up around the pandemic that you've worked on or researched and started to analyze?
Yeah, I actually think I'm going to skip around slides a little bit just because I think the easiest way to talk about this is to think about the sort of framework that we applied for ourselves. And I'll kind of give a quick overview of that, and then I'll let Pam give some specific examples to start with. Because I think that there's been so much news that we tried to be very intentional and critical with how, what stories we were elevating, kind of what we were looking for as a way to break through and make a difference, and just try to, we we used to say at Media Matters that we get paid to watch Fox News so other people don't have to. And I kind of think our role in high volume information situations is, what can we provide to people to kind of think about the news in a way that they don't have to be the ones consuming all of that. So in the context of COVID, some of the ways that we tried to think about the impact of our work were these things. So, what are the public health risks associated with a piece of misinformation? Is it dangerous for Fox News to say that COVID isn't here and there's no reason to get tested? So what are the sort of ways that we can quickly intervene to point out a pattern of something like that? Who is being hurt, which I won't elaborate on because I think there's a bunch of content-specific examples that tell the story better than I would in the moment. But, just sort of thinking about the impact of certain pieces of misinformation. Sort of the flip side of that then is, are there people who are benefiting, thinking again about that intentional spread of disinformation? Are there people who are benefiting from spreading a claim or from, talking about COVID in a certain way? And then finally, something that kind of pervades throughout thinking about all of these things is just how can we sort of utilize our platform and our role sort of as, a filter for some of this information to make sure that we're telling stories and giving space to stories that maybe aren't going to break through otherwise because of, unintentional media bias potentially. So that's kind of how we've been trying to think about COVID writ large. And obviously there's lots of different valences to that, but that's kind of the overview. I think some specific examples of that then, Pam, if you want to start in and we can kind of trade off.
Sure. I would just also underscore that obviously a question we're always asking is who is harmed by this? And it's a question that is really top of mind right now because obviously there's a sort of harm that you can trace to almost any form of political disinformation or misinformation, but right now it is much easier to draw that line. So it's sort of more important now than ever, but also as Noor mentioned, people are just online more right now. We're already online more in a longer term trend, but right now a lot of people are literally stuck at home, and the primary way that they're engaging with the world or even doing their own activism on a personal level is all happening online. So the stakes have sort of never been higher than they are right now, especially when we see such real world impact of not only just straight up misinformation or disinformation, but also that bias piece that Sharon talked about.
I switched slides because I didn't want to stare at Tucker Carlson's face while you talked about who was hurt.
Valid. So these two sets of examples, these are all screenshots of articles that are on our website. So this is research that we have deemed to be important enough to put on our website and try and share with the general audience to help with general media literacy around mostly coronavirus specific examples. So when we're thinking about who is being hurt, often the question is who is the audience for the media that we're critiquing? Obviously, again, the bread and butter of what we've done for years has been conservative news for a primarily conservative audience that knows what they're tuning into. And obviously, we can see the harms of those folks too. But we're also thinking about new audiences, both online and in more traditional forms of mainstream media. So all of these examples, almost all of them, maybe all, are maybe not what you would consider to be a conservative news source. We have this example with Chuck Todd, where there are people that are considered sort of the mainstream anchors, reporters on your nightly news or your Sunday shows, who are allowing people to come onto that platform and repeat falsehoods, or in this case, rhetoric that harms people directly. And a lot of what we focused on related to coronavirus specifically is not just the public health harm, but also the harm to marginalized communities that are often the people that are most attacked over almost any news story. So for coronavirus specifically, we've done a lot of work tracing specifically anti-Asian, anti-Chinese rhetoric. We know that there is a lot of evidence, both anecdotal and otherwise, that violence and racism against Asian people is up right now, and especially at the beginning of the pandemic, in the US anyway. And so we try and pinpoint where are the ways that media, either intentionally or unintentionally, is contributing to that environment. So it could be something like Chuck Todd hosting Peter Navarro and letting him call the coronavirus the China virus. It could also be in the bottom corner, news outlets who are sort of carelessly using random stock photos of people who are, East Asian to illustrate stories about the coronavirus that are not, it doesn't, match up. They're literally just choosing random people or stock photos or people with masks on, and sort of creating this false, again, not necessarily an outright lie, but sort of an environment that is ripe for misinformation to spread through less intentional or less clear-cut examples. And then some of these other examples on this slide especially are more about reaching different audiences than we would normally think of. So we have Joe Rogan, who is like by...
I think Pam maybe froze, but I know what she was going to say about Joe Rogan, which is that he has a huge following sort of as a podcaster. And so we're always really concerned when someone like Joe Rogan has figures like, for example, Elon Musk on, who right-wing media recently have taken to sort of championing his calls to reopen the country. And so examples like this kind of show how, podcasts and sort of other forms of media are able to, spread misinformation. And audiences that are tuning into Joe Rogan maybe don't realize that, this is sort of a talking point that they're getting. This other example that's on the screen is kind of the bread and butter of the stuff that I find myself looking at a lot, which is thinking about how Facebook and different sort of communities within Facebook are able to be either intentionally or unintentionally mobilized to spread misinformation. So in this case, it was a network of linked Facebook pages that were spreading a bunch of like pretty harmful conspiracy theories about coronavirus, and also promoting the idea, like very obvious medical misinformation, like the idea that you shouldn't wear a mask because it'll make the spread of coronavirus worse. So claims like that, where even as like not a medical expert, we can pretty easily point to medical experts who would refute that. So these are sort of examples of thinking about the who is hurt piece of things. The kind of next bucket of things really quickly for sort of thinking about coverage is just people taking advantage of the situation. I don't think we need to get into the specifics of these examples too deeply, but we included a couple of examples from our website of people who were either using Facebook or utilizing sort of different platforms to promote fake coronavirus cures. These ones seem pretty out there, but unfortunately there is evidence that people under times of stress, I think, want to believe or are more susceptible to believing things. And so when people are very actively taking advantage of that to try and make money, that is not only obviously harmful, it's pretty frustrating. And the opportunities that we sort of took to identify those ones, especially when someone had a relationship with, you know, I think the obvious example is like InfoWars or Alex Jones, who you might be familiar with from some of the like really awful conspiracy theories that he spread in the past. Sort of when people are able to do stuff like that. So I would group things like people trying to sell fake cures, placing Facebook ads for like masks or PPE that they're never going to deliver, you know, anything like that. I would also group with this other side of things, which is just using those same kind of using those same techniques to spread conspiracy theories. So this is just sort of a sampling of the different types of stuff. I think we don't have to get into like the details of these because they are inaccurate conspiracy theories, but just to kind of show that there are a lot of different ways of thinking about harm, and there's a lot of different ways to kind of call it out.
Thanks, Sharon. I know Pam's going to be on again shortly, just dealing with the technical issue. But if
You're stuck with me.
I take it. I'll take it. I wanted to dig in a little bit more about how these articles actually travel online.
Mhm.
Like, could you tell us a little bit about whether it's reposts or whether it's like chain letter emails? Like, how do we usually see these theories move through the internet?
Mm-hmm. The conspiracy theories or just misinformation generally?
Let's start with misinformation generally and then go into the conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I think in terms of misinformation generally, it varies, but I think there's sort of two broad categories for thinking about spread. There's the sort of articles that have misinformation in them that get shared to Facebook, and then, you know, from there proliferate, get shared. Somebody shares it to their friend, it gets reposted to a wall, gets shared to a group, stuff like that. So there's sort of organic spread where, you know, somebody introduces it to an ecosystem of people, and then it kind of goes from there. And then there's a lot of debate, I think, among like academics and scholars about what inorganic spread would mean, but I would use that in this case to be like there in the context of Facebook to talk about networks of pages that are utilized explicitly to amplify content that's inaccurate. And the example I would give of that would be, so for example, on this screen, you know, businesses using Facebook to promote, you know, conspiracy theory related things. Like there's a network of pages that utilize that infrastructure to push it to their audiences very intentionally. Another easy example of that is if you're familiar with like Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire, that outlet, which is home to a lot of, I think, harmful misinformation about a lot of different topics. Having come from the world of doing a lot of abortion rights work, like that outlet has a lot of things to say that are inaccurate about reproductive health and reproductive rights. But we've observed, and other outlets have observed, the phenomena where an article will go up on like Ben Shapiro's page or the Daily Wire's page, and then within a second, it'll go up on every single property associated with the Daily Wire. And so that type of activity where, you know, it's not just that there are real people spreading it, but there's a concentrated effort by, you know, a network of pages or a group of people to spread it, are kind of how we'll see the general ways of claim spreading.
Thanks, Sharon. And Pam, welcome back. Sharon was just walking us through a follow-up question I had around how misinformation, how you all see misinformation travel on the internet, versus conspiracy theories, you know, if it's reposts or through viewership, etc. So if there's anything you want to add to that, go for it. If not, we'll get into the next question.
Let's go ahead.
All right. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, I know we discussed some examples around COVID specifically, but I'd like to pivot to talking about protests. I know that there has been, you know, a series of different forms of misinformation and also disinformation in terms of Facebook events being posted, pointing people to nefarious actors or, you know, even mainstream media, you know, adopting different lines and phrases around what's actually happening on the ground versus what we're seeing from organizers. So I'd just love to hear from both of you about what's happening right now in terms of mass mobilizations, protests, and how information is traveling.
Sure. So we, one thing that we focus on a lot that is sort of what we think of as passive misinformation is not just those bad headlines we talked about a little bit, which is like, okay, somebody says something like a direct quote about a protest, for example, like saying that Trump says the protests are violent. And then the headline of a piece might just say Trump, protest is violent. And there's nothing in that headline that indicates that what he is saying is not 100% accurate. That is a really common sort of passive misinformation that we're tracking, and it's a bad habit in mainstream media. Another is also just the general use of passive voice. So not just with the protests, but thinking about the police brutality that a lot of these protests are focused on. There are a lot of examples of folks who are calling out mainstream outlets, social media, so not even necessarily like a New York Times article, but maybe the tweet about the article is not good, where we're using passive voice to sort of obscure who is responsible for, in this case, someone's killing. So examples like that would be, you know, a knee was on a neck. And I don't want to get too into it because I don't think that we necessarily need to be very graphic in this conversation, but those sorts of sort of was killed versus who did the killing, that is a really bad habit that we see pop up a lot. And I think in general around both police brutality and police action, as well as around the protests, a lot of the bad habits that we're really focused on are coming from those sources that you wouldn't necessarily expect it from, not from Fox, because we all know Fox is going to be bad on that. At least we all on this webinar know that. But we're thinking about, you know, not just the passive voice or those sort of bad headlines, but also who's being quoted in specific articles. I kind of mentioned this at the top, but if you are reading an article about a protest and there's no quotes from the organizers or no indication that whoever wrote the article or is, you know, reporting live from the scene in the local news, for example, has actually engaged with the organizers of the protest, it's much harder to trust the information in that article. Another thing that we've been tracking that's sort of related is when news outlets, both local and national, are uncritically running with police statements about any sort of event without attempting to sort of independently verify that in any way. There's a pretty noticeable pattern at this point. We have focused a little bit on NYPD specifically because it's been an area with a lot of protest activity and because there are just so many examples. They seem particularly bad at this. But examples where local outlets or local outlets with a large readership, like the New York Daily News or the New York Post, are just running with big headlines about protesters stealing millions of dollars in Rolex watches. And then when you read the article, you realize they're basing it on one police statement, and the person who owns the store said there were no Rolexes, stuff like that, where maybe there isn't a direct harm in that sort of misinformation. That's pretty bad, but it's a kind of contributing to that larger environment for more dangerous misinformation to also spread. You're priming a larger audience to believe certain things about the protesters, about the police, that are going to make it easier for those moments of truly dangerous misinformation to catch on. I think another example that I'd talk about is related to the autonomous zone in Seattle. So we put out a report yesterday that Fox News has spent in a 1-week time period almost 9 hours talking about the autonomous zone. And the spoiler alert is it's not good. So they're sometimes running with very clear fear-mongering misinformation about, you know, businesses being extorted, for example. They even published some photos where they spliced together images from different days so that it looked like there was a guy with an AR-15 at the autonomous zone who literally was not there. That is a very obvious example. But it's also a lot of more commentary, rhetorical stuff that, again, sort of contributes to the overall environment that makes misinformation easier, an easier environment for misinformation to spread. And again, that is also not just related to Fox. I think anytime there's an example like this where people are doing really cool, radical stuff, Fox will attack them, of course, but also there's a lot of general interest from a wider audience. And so you're also bringing a lot of reporters into the fold to cover this who don't have experience covering a movement like this or covering protests and organizing, which means that not only do we have the bad actors that we know about that are spreading clear misinformation, but we also have new folks who are coming onto the scene and don't have the background or the context, or especially in local news, the resources to do a great job reporting on it. So we kind of are trying to think about both elements of that, not just, and I think honestly, that is also true with coronavirus. We have a lot of reporters who are not public health experts who are now suddenly having to switch over what they're covering every day. And that's a moment where we can help, again, with that filter that Sharon talked about, getting the best resources to people like that so that they can do their jobs more effectively. Is there anything about protests you would add, Sharon, as an overview?
I don't think as an overview. I can talk a little bit about Facebook stuff just very briefly. I mentioned that just because we included the picture of this study that we did on this slide, which I think Pam really spoke to. I think the tension between there are bad actors that we know exist, and then there's actually a much larger pool of people who are often well-intentioned but just don't have the resources or experience to cover things as thoughtfully as we might like. And so I raised that study because we looked at I won't try to quote the total number of posts off the top of my head because I'll definitely get it wrong, but a lot of Facebook posts from right-leaning Facebook pages, left-leaning Facebook pages, and then non-aligned or like straight news as you think of it pages. And we found that not only were there most of the engagements on Facebook on those posts were coming from right-wing posts with like negative framing about the protests, claiming they were violent. But actually, I think something that was really concerning is even the non-aligned posts, or the ones that were supposed to be straight news, we found oftentimes were echoing a lot of the same narratives. Not because they like were trying to repeat Fox News, but just because I think once you kind of have the heuristic frame in mind about what a protest is or like what a movement is, reporters, especially without the experience, and find themselves repeating things maybe without realizing it. So I think that's a good example of how some of those same patterns in like print or TV coverage manifest themselves on Facebook too.
Thank you. I didn't know all of that stuff about Seattle, and I'm seeing folks from Seattle talk about the difference in terms of what they're seeing on the ground in the chat box, and including examples of somebody's arm being photoshopped. So clearly, this is a whole spectrum of, I think, how nefarious some of these narratives can really be. So I wanted to get us into talking about resources. And I would love to actually split this question up into two. The first one being about how anyone can incorporate some best practices into acting as their own filters on social media and reading the news. And then the second component of the question, and I'll ask it again once we're through the first, is how do you talk to people about this? Like, is there a way to approach them, especially because it's a lot of unlearning to be able to identify, this newspaper that I've been reading my whole life actually has a track record of not exactly giving right information. So I'd love for us to spend a little bit of time on that second. But with the first one, what are some best practices and resources that you'd like to share with us?
Let's see, we can skip around a little bit because I think you're right that those are two very related but important to discuss both parts of it. So I think for the first part of it, just sort of what are some best practices? Like this is again sort of a framework, and then we can kind of talk through specifics. But the best thing, and it sounds a little trite, but the best thing to do is just be a critical consumer of information. We recognize that that's really difficult, and everybody makes mistakes with this, frankly, because there's just so much information out there. But some things that you can always do are before you share something, think about the source, whether that's doing a quick search to see, like, is it actually a local source? Like, is this something that is this a page that just got started on Facebook like a month ago and is now claiming to be like Detroit local news? Or is this like an outlet that has been like reporting on the community for a while? So check the source, see if you can kind of figure out like where something is coming from. And related to that, think about, who benefits from this story being true? Like who has something to gain? And related to that, does it seem like it's too good to be true? I think especially when it comes to news sometimes these days, there are things we really want to be true, or that, because at least for me, I feel like I'm really desperate for good news. So I'm, increasingly likely to want to share stuff like that. And kind of checking myself and being like, okay, is this something that I can find like corroboration somewhere else that someone else is saying this happened, or am I just really excited and want this to be true? And both things can be true. Like it can actually be a good thing that happened and someone else can be reporting on it. But the sort of more examples you can find of somebody reporting a fact doesn't always mean it's true, but is usually a good sign that it's not, you know, a one-off or someone intentionally kind of manipulating a situation. So sort of different ways of vetting information, I think all important. In other instances, if something is circulating that is just obviously inaccurate, I think there have been examples like throughout the primary season where we've seen like reports that either accidentally, or we'll say accidentally, like misreport like a polling location or a time, something that's inaccurate and has like clear harm. You can report misinformation on different platforms, and we can talk a little bit about that. But I think that can be helpful sometimes. And then the last sort of general thing that I'll say is, and I think this kind of gets to the second part of the question, so I won't elaborate too much here, but just the importance of making sure that we're not just telling people they're wrong when we're correcting misinformation, but also replacing that with accurate information and making sure that we're being constructive in a way to provide, you know, something to kind of latch onto. And there are a lot of studies in terms of how, you know, cognitively people think about claims and beliefs, but there is evidence to show that people are more likely to change their mind if you can give them another thing to kind of latch onto and another reason why something is or isn't true. So not just sort of telling people they're wrong, but also replacing that inaccurate information with something that people can then kind of utilize when they talk about that topic too. And that's kind of an overview. Pam, I think if you want to talk about specifics with any of that stuff or talk about the second part either, whatever works.
Sure. I would add a few things to just like some basic questions you can be asking yourself when you are encountering this information. I think that it is probably not realistic that every article that you see, you would take the minute to open a new window, Google whether somebody else has also reported the same thing, that sort of stuff. So some other more like shortcut things. Number one, if you aren't sure, there's way less harm in not sharing something than there is in sharing something that's inaccurate. So if you are not sure, just don't share it. Nobody is expecting you to share everything. Much rather have that happen than contribute to spreading something that's inaccurate. The other thing is, I would also encourage people to stay away from text-only posts on social media. So if you see a tweet or a Facebook post or something like that that is claiming a bunch of factual information and there's no corroboration offered, no citation, no link that's taking you to another spot, usually that is a red flag, and I tend to not want to personally share anything that is a text or an image, like a screenshot, without some sort of external link or way to verify it. So even if you're not able to take the time to do that yourself, you're at least sort of thinking about, if I'm going to share this, are the people that I'm sharing, do they have the tools to check it themselves too? So that's another thing that I would mention. And then I think more broadly, it's just important to remember that, like we talked about a little bit at the top, sharing information online, especially right now, is a form of activism. And so you have to take on the responsibility of what that means. It's not just about passing on the information, but it's also thinking about the audience. And again, who stands to gain? Is it too good to be true? Part of being in the progressive movement and pushing for change means that we need to be better. We need to be the good side, quote unquote. We don't want to also find ourselves susceptible to misinformation that is proving our point of view. People, like Sharon mentioned, are more likely to share articles or information that sort of confirms what they already believe. And that is a human nature thing, not a conservative information thing. So that's something that we all need to be diligent about, because again, like, this goes back to your personal activism and what you stand for. So something to keep in mind. It's not just, obviously there's a whole other conversation to be had about like clicking online as a form of activism or whatever, and that's not what we're here to talk about. But in any time you're engaging with news, you have an opportunity to either leave the world a little bit better than how you found it, or worse, or just stay away from sharing it in the first place. So just something to keep in mind that I try to remember.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Sharon. So before moving into tips that we have in terms of how to talk to people in your own life about this, a few questions that we got over email and are also seeing in the chat are about like fact-checking resources, right? Like we have Snopes, we have different fact check sites. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to some tried and true places where somebody who might not have time to immediately Google something or cross-reference can sort of quickly get a gut check on something, if that exists.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. So Snopes, generally good. I think another way of checking things is the process that fact checkers will go through. A lot of times they'll link out to like primary sources. And so I think to the extent that people are able to kind of check those things themselves, it's always helpful. So for example, with coronavirus misinformation, like can we actually see like the data that they're pulling from to make a claim? And I think that's especially, an example we saw recently of that was, Vice President Mike Pence was claiming in a lot of media interviews that, the status of cases in Oklahoma was one thing, but the local like data might show a different thing. So the one, fact checkers should be doing that work, but two, if you can check those primary sources yourself, I think that's also really good. Another thing to be cautious of, I think, is that not all fact checkers are the same. We've seen this a lot in the context of Facebook's fact checking program, which is again a different conversation. But I would just say if you can read the about us section of like the PolitiFact or the Snopes or whatever you're checking, just because for example, the Facebook fact checking network does have a lot of legitimate fact checkers, but it also has the Daily Caller, which is a conservative outlet, as part of its fact checking network. So I think that the instinct to rely on fact checkers is good, but also let's make sure that we're checking our fact checkers so we know kind of what, if they have a point of view and if that's manifesting in their fact checking. That's sort of my caution. Pam, can you think of any other sort of like sites besides PolitiFact or Snopes that would be helpful?
Factcheck.org is pretty good. Yeah, Snopes is great. I think it's like a sort of silly name maybe, so people think that it might not be reliable, but we cite Snopes and use Snopes. They often will fact check the same things that we're trying to fact check. Obviously, Media Matters. We, like any other fact checker or fact checking adjacent organization, have a point of view. We are a progressive organization, so something to keep in mind, but we are also 100% accurate and we pride ourselves on that. So obviously you can check our website, MediaMatters.org. We'll also share that at the end. But I think what Sharon is saying is really important to remember. Most fact checkers are not actually looking at one specific article or claim and then using just that article to figure out whether it's true or not with different clues. They're actually immediately clicking out of it and going to 5 other places. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that you can do that, it is better. Obviously, we know it's not totally realistic. You are not being paid to be a fact checker like they are. But really the fact checkers approach is to basically almost immediately get off the page where they see something and see what else is out in the world.
Thanks, Pam. And you said, did you say factcheck.org? Is that the website you mentioned?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Cool. I wanted to ask about the second bullet point here about reporting misinformation. How does that work? How do we do that?
Yeah, I think we have one slide with an example, but it's obviously a little different on every platform. I think sort of 2 things. One, so every platform has a mechanism for reporting misinformation. I think we can kind of sidebar a larger conversation about the efficacy of like how they then act on these things and whether or not the policies are set up in a way that actually prevents the spread of misinformation, but I will table that for now and just say that every platform does have a way that you can report misinformation. This is an example of how you would do that on Facebook. This is a post from Sean Hannity's Facebook page showing old stock footage claiming that the CHOP autonomous zone is like lawless and violent. If you wanted to report this as inaccurate, you would click, usually it's like the 3 dots on the side, or on Twitter, it's like a little arrow that you click for a drop down. And each of those will pull up a menu, something like this, where you would then say like why you're reporting it, and then the platform should take action. I think that it's useful to report things because the more evidence there is that there's a problem or a pattern, the better information that platforms have to act on, the caution that I will give with that then is that there's a lot of evidence, particularly in the context of Facebook, but Twitter is also not perfect at this. And I think Instagram is kind of in a weird in-between, because as a Facebook product, it is complicated, but where reporting misinformation doesn't necessarily mean they act on it, but with enough pressure, oftentimes, there can be sort of a public call for them to take certain types of misinformation more seriously. And although the platforms are not perfect at that, that kind of pressure is, I think, the thing that forces them to act versus hoping that they will just do it themselves.
Cool, thank you. I want us to shift to the second piece. I know that it's something that, you know, the Women's March does through our Digital Defenders program, though it is primarily focused on just people on the internet, right? Less so about your parents or your grandparents or that friend you haven't talked to in a really long time who keeps posting something that you know you fact checked and is wrong, but you want to be able to approach them in a way that is respectful and with love and compassion to get them to unlearn some of these daily practices. So I'd love if you could speak a little bit to that, or how maybe you've approached that in your own lives, if that's come across your way.
I can talk about that. So I think the first is just to assume best intentions with everybody. I think that obviously there are many exceptions to that rule. You don't need to be engaging with people who are very clearly like racist or something. Like, that's not what I mean when I say assume best intentions. But for folks where, you know, they are sort of, like Nora mentioned at the very top of this conversation, in the middle and seem movable. It's actually also how we are approaching different sources at Media Matters. We're not necessarily trying to fact check Fox with the assumption that Fox will change, but we are trying to make sure that those people in the middle who are just trying to do their jobs as journalists can do a better job. So you're really zoning in, number one, on people that you think are movable. Don't waste your energy. We all have a finite amount of it. And if you're trying to be an effective person and an activist, the goal isn't to waste your time getting frustrated with someone whose mind can't be changed. It's to find those people who, if you can't even assume best intent all around, you can at least identify one thing that you might agree on, which is the other sort of piece of advice, is find one thing you can kind of agree on. For example, my dad is a libertarian. We don't agree on very much, but we can agree on some things related to, for example, what he would think of as government waste. Like, I would suggest to somebody who is more progressive, like, yeah, I'd actually think that there is some examples of that. And it's frustrating for me because I want to have a really effective government who can serve everyone. And if we can both agree that we don't want a government waste, and then, you know, find that point and then say, oh, so this is why you feel, you know, this is why you would share this meme on Facebook about, I don't know, like SNAP benefits or something. This is my perspective on this. And I think that we both agree X, but, you know, and we go from there. A lot of times when people are sharing this information, they're also sharing it because of that confirmation bias we talked about. So it's more about figuring out why they would share something and then approaching it from that perspective, versus, for example, leading right with, this is wrong and here's why, because people don't like to be called stupid, basically, and they might interpret it that way. So the goal is always to say, like, hey, I know you're sharing this for X, Y reasons. Or if it's somebody like, for example, on your Instagram who you're friends with, and you just know that they're sharing something that we've since realized is no longer like a good thing to share. Hey, I know you didn't mean to do this, but I just happened to actually realize this myself and X, Y, Z. Those are just a couple like initial thoughts that came to mind.
Sharon, any tips and tricks on your end?
I think Pam covered the bulk of them. I think the two things I would pull out really quick would just be protecting your time and protecting your sort of finite mental and emotional energy, especially when it comes to like trolls or people who are acting in bad faith and like are very intentionally trying to instigate and are not looking to actually have a dialogue, no matter how much they claim they might be. It is not incumbent on you to always engage with those folks. And so thinking critically about the times where it's going to be most beneficial to do that. And then the second thing would just be to approach those conversations with humility and grace, because like you said, people are online now more than ever, and just continuing to approach those conversations from the perspective of actually wanting to find a common ground or like have a conversation and make the world better, I think is something that can benefit those.
Thank you both. And something that came up in the chat, and I think Pam, you spoke to this a little bit, is, how do you know it's the movable middle? So I can speak to that a little bit. And, in terms of, I would say like finding shared values. I think you can tell a lot by how someone appears on the internet about what they care about. Like if they say that they're mad about trash or waste, like that that's somebody who you could potentially move into talking about the climate. Or if it's someone that might be coming from what I see as like a very apple pie American approach of talking about individual liberty, like there might be some room to talk about autonomy a little bit in there. Like I think that's something that's a little bit harder, but that there is a value there that can be interrogated a little bit more. So I usually look at not their political posts, but things that they share that are not about the news and that are not about something that's happening in the world, but something that might be a little bit more personal, because I think that that tells us a lot more about their character and how they move through the world than the news necessarily. Cool. So Sharon, I think you started going there about protecting your energy. And I am very interested in how much information both of you and the rest of Media Matters consumes. And I know it's probably different for different roles. But how do you handle it? Like, when do you know that it's time to step back a little bit? It's fine if you don't have the answer to this either, right? Like no one knows exactly how to handle all the terrible things in the world. But any sort of guidance you have on when it's okay to step back and be able to manage everything that's coming your way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard. All of us, I think, now are so online and there's so much news that it's really difficult to know. I think it's difficult to know when you sort of hit your limit, but also being honest with yourself about when you get to that point. And, Pam and I, we both like manage folks in our team. And this is a conversation that we've been trying to have with a lot of them, which is just that, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Making sure that you're being honest with yourself and us about just like where you're at. And it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to feel overwhelmed, but that the best way to sort of respond to that is to know your limit, call it out, and then kind of be able to step back at that point, because you're not going to do as much good to anybody exhausted. And it's not good for you to get to that point where you're exhausted. So like you said, that sort of energy is finite, and just being cognizant and open with people to the extent that you're comfortable with sort of calling out your limit and asking people to respect your limit as well. I think is sort of how we think about that in ways, but also finding ways that you can protect your time and like not consume the news 24/7 is also good. Like, I feel like I've been reading more like physical copy books during quarantine, just because I need to not look at a screen as much, which feels like kind of a weird answer, but whatever you can kind of do to carve out that space for yourself, I would recommend.
Yeah, 100%. Finding some time that is screen free is very important to me as well. I watch a lot of Bravo and go for walks safely with my mask, and I don't talk to anybody. But those are things. But also, I think something that gives me a lot of comfort is thinking about self-care through the activist lens in two ways. One is that this is why coalitions matter, because I think most people that are doing any form of advocating for change in any capacity you want to do good and you want to help people, and so your tendency is to kind of put the whole world on your shoulders. And when you have a really strong coalition, I don't have to be an organizer. I can be an expert on misinformation because I know and trust people who are mostly organizers, and we can create a more collaborative environment where I trust certain groups to do the work that I can't do, and I know where I can lean in and provide an actual value that is something that not only me, but like not as many people are experts on. So finding those places where you personally, either because of your experiences, the way that you are engaging with the world, anything that can give you a sort of, this is my niche, this is the thing that I can do every day to help, is really helpful, I think. And then also, quite frankly, this has been true at various moments for the entire time that I worked at Media Matters, but sometimes the way that I take care of myself is to remind myself that I have the privilege that my day job is helping people. Not most people don't have that privilege, and so you have to work a lot harder to protect your time as an extracurricular with how you engage with activism. But we are doing it all day, which is cool, and it's nice to feel like you're on the quote unquote front lines in some way and know that you are doing something that is aligned with your values. But it also means that it can be a little bit easier for us in some ways to log off sometimes, because we already know that we've done something, quote unquote. So I think just being very aware of the sort of pressure that you put on yourself and reminding yourself that no one person can do everything, and the best way to actually make changes through big coalitions with a lot of people that are all doing their own special little thing.
Thank you both. So I'm going to move us into some questions, and actually wanted to start off with one that relates to what you just said about making a difference. I'm wondering if there are any moments that either of you can speak to about how you helped amend the facts and bring the reality to the forefront, and were able to have a positive impact through your work at Media Matters. I know, Pam, you can probably speak to Sinclair, but I know that there's probably, other tidbits that that would be wise to share with everyone.
Pam, do you want to talk about Sinclair? I know it's near and dear to you.
Sure. So for about 2 years of my time at Media Matters, what I was doing most days was watching Sinclair news programming and then responding to it in some way. So to back up for a second, for people who might not be familiar with Sinclair, some people would maybe describe them as the Fox News of local news. They're a huge broadcasting company. They own or operate almost 200 local TV news stations in most states across the country, and here in DC, where Sharon and I are based, and some others on this panel. And they are very nefarious. And part of the reason why they've been able to grow so quickly and expand in a way to control such a large part of the local news landscape is because people don't know their name. I didn't really know them that well before my editor at the time assigned me to write one piece about them. And then I got so riled up that it became my whole life for about 2 years, and I still can't let go. But the reason why I don't like them is because they capitalize on what we talked about earlier, which is that people tend to trust their local news a little bit more. And that's because the source in that case are people that you might know. Either you know them, you've seen them at the supermarket, they're a friend of a friend, or you just know that they're part of your community because they're, reporting live from your farmer's market on the weekend or something like that. Sinclair sort of capitalizes on that built-in trust and produces segments in their national headquarters, which are in Baltimore and sometimes in DC, and distributes them for all their stations across the country that broadcast news to broadcast. That in and of itself is actually not that scary. A lot of big broadcast companies do that. Like ABC owns local stations, some of them, and they do that, for example. That part is not concerning. What's concerning is examples of outright misinformation and also bias that are showing up in some of that national programming. Some of it is very clear. Some of it is labeled commentary. It's starring, Eric Bolling, who used to work at Fox News. It's pretty clear what his point of view is. Some of it is not labeled as commentary, and it's showing up in your local newscast. And when you're watching, for example, NBC5 or whatever your local stations are, it doesn't say anywhere on the screen, this is the Sinclair station. So that is another example where it's not online misinformation where you have to kind of do your research by clicking into new tabs, but it is another example where it's beneficial for you to know who stands to gain from some of this misinformation. Most corporate media stands to gain from policies that benefit corporations, and Sinclair is no exception to that. The people that run Sinclair are Trump supporters. Some people that they employ are Trump supporters. Some are maybe just trying to do their jobs. and unfortunately have to give up some of that time for local stations to rebroadcast those national segments that are not great. So I think that the Sinclair victory is that in the last few years, they've tried to expand more. And one thing that we've done at Media Matters is basically make it our mission for people to know what the word Sinclair means and to recognize that name, because it means that folks, number one, are learning, is there a station in my local media market that is owned by Sinclair? One way to find that out is that we actually built a smaller website called findsinclair.com, where you can literally type in an address, a zip code, whatever, and it'll show you the nearest Sinclair station. But it's also encouraging just a higher base level of media literacy across the board, because I think a lot of people, when they learn about Sinclair, realize, God, I don't know who owns any of my local stations. I should probably look that up. And it kind of can confer some awareness there. So for our part, not only are we sort of trying to boost the name recognition and not allow big corporate companies like that to expand under the radar, but also I would say just generally encouraging people to be more aware of sort of what are the corporate interests that underpin whatever news sources you're going to. And I think the more people know about Sinclair, the less likely they can fly under the radar. And so obviously that's not just us doing that work. I've seen some people commenting, yes, John Oliver did a segment on Sinclair a while back. There was a big Deadspin video where they spliced together a bunch of the reporters across the country saying the same stuff. It's definitely not just us, but in general, any sort of drumbeat that we can do to keep people thinking about Sinclair, it kind of keeps them from, fading into the background and letting themselves off the hook.
Yeah, I'll add one thing really quick, and my example will be brief, but I think I'm really proud of the work that we've done. And again, it's not just us doing it, to sort of quantify the spread of misinformation on Facebook. And the example I give for that is that something that we see a lot in conservative media and talking points about the platforms more broadly is this idea that conservative speech is censored. And I'm pretty proud of the work that our team has done to actually pull the data, analyze the post, look at the engagement stats, and figure out that in almost all cases, conservative or at least right-leaning posts, regardless of the content of them, get higher engagements. And so this talking point about censorship and how the platforms are rigged against Fox News is not only self-serving, it's factually inaccurate in a way that I think, thanks to the work of some of the folks on our team, we can actually point to hard data instead of just a bunch of anecdotal evidence.
Awesome. So this is a good segue into, and I'm going to couple some of the questions that we've been getting, but folks are eager to learn about how to keep media accountable. And, one question that we got was, what about when it's a big outlet? What if it's something like Newsweek, which we got a question about specifically, that shared work from a Sinclair outlet with little to no additional fact checking or context? And there's an article specifically from May 13th and around employment and unemployment benefits. And coupled with that is a second question, which is, how do you hold local media's feet to the fire to accurately tell the story, or to call out or point out people that they interview who are spreading false information? So both on the national level and on the local level. And I think with the local level, we've also gotten a few questions around letters to the editor, right? Or op-eds. What kind of limited control do we have over that type of content? If you could give us any guidance on that front.
Yeah, I think I'll speak to sort of part of the local just framework, and then Pam, if you want to talk about some of the Sinclair and national level stuff or whatever, we can kind of trade off. I think thinking about engaging with local news is always something that as a national organization, we try to be really conscientious about, because like Pam mentioned earlier, a lot of times with local reporting, the issues are not often that people are intentionally doing something. It's that, we know that the decimation of newsrooms at the local level from a resource and staffing perspective is just immense. And that has gotten only more true under coronavirus. So I think to the extent that you're able to engage with sort of your local stakeholders or know who the people to talk to are, the better. So for example, When I was doing abortion rights work, we would sometimes work with like local organizations to try and figure out like a media engagement plan. And part of the advice that we would give there is sort of, if there's an issue or a group of issues that you're really interested in, try to figure out like who the reporters are that are writing on that topic a lot. And if you're noticing, that they're missing context on something or that they're not like talking to the right people, sort of make a good faith effort to engage with them. Because oftentimes I think local reporters, they want more information. They want to be able to better represent their communities. And it's something that they take a lot of pride in. And so finding ways to kind of connect with them and figuring out who you can talk to that isn't just like nameless editor, at the editorial address for the paper. So that would be my first piece of advice, is just kind of see if you can figure out like who the people to talk to would even be. And depending on the outlet and your ability to kind of have time to do that outreach, that can be pretty fruitful. The other thing then is with letters to the editor and sort of op-eds. I think those can be really powerful tools, especially if, you're advocating for particular changes. I think especially that's a really good way to kind of make your voice heard in the community. Something that we've observed is, it's important, if only to kind of make people who are reading and consuming that news aware that there are lots of different viewpoints, because if only one thing is represented in the op-ed pages or only one thing is represented in the letters to the editor, it can sometimes give the appearance that maybe only one point of view is dominant, when in fact, a lot of people probably care very deeply about the issues. So I think those can be really powerful, and especially coupled with some dedicated outreach to local media can be hopefully encourage like better coverage on things too.
I would also add that in terms of like larger companies, there's actually a lot that you can do as an average consumer. There are often for like regulation specific stuff. So for example, when Sinclair is trying to expand, there are usually public comment periods with the FCC. So that's one way to engage as just a member of the public. And also for most like major media corporations, there's like a lot of it is really based on who is profiting, not just who is ideologically benefiting from the information, but who's profiting from a highly clickable piece of information that might not be accurate. And so when you also are thinking about engaging with bigger mainstream media outlets through the lens of who is profiting, there are shareholder meetings that you can be monitoring. There are advertisers. So one thing that we do a lot at Media Matters is what we think of as advertiser education. So we're not asking anyone to boycott things. What we're saying is we want your advertisers to be aware of the types of stuff that their name is being associated with. So advertiser education is also a big one. Oftentimes the incentive, again, for most larger corporations, maybe some of them really do want you to have the correct information and they're getting into the news business for the right idea or for the right reasons, but it doesn't mean that, demonstrating your perspective as a consumer isn't valuable in kind of pushing people to do a better job or do the right thing.
Thank you. I had two follow-ups. One, Sharon, when you mentioned reaching out directly to some writers, is there generally a good return rate with that? Do you find that some journalists are a little bit more open to speaking? Would you recommend doing that over Twitter, or do you have any tips on that front?
It's unfortunately, the answer is that it just depends on the person. I think I've seen instances where reporters are really active on Twitter and like respond to DMs or like want to engage in like the comments. And that's obviously like, reporters have to do the same thing with like protecting their time and energy too. So I think even if people don't respond, it's not that they aren't interested in engaging. Another way that you can kind of engage in that outreach sometimes is that oftentimes papers will have either editorial boards or like an editorial address, and you can try to engage through those channels. I think there's power in numbers too. So if there's an issue that you're in particular interested in, seeing if you can either one, you're already part of an organization in your community that's advocating for those things, and sort of with the power of an institution or a group, you can kind of approach them and hopefully by virtue of representing a lot of voices simultaneously get through. Or, if that doesn't exist in your community, maybe connect with the Women's March and see if they can help you figure it out too.
Thanks, Sharon. So we got a good question that I think speaks off of op-eds, right? Is moving away from local newspapers. What about when the New York Times, runs an op-ed like the one we saw recently with Tom Cotton advocating for military response to protests? And the person who wrote the question said, a big concern of mine is when media outlets insist on giving equal time to people who are acting in bad faith to spread misinformation or disinformation to represent a diversity of viewpoints. Could you speak to the ways that the issue of objectivity and equal time in this context can be highly problematic?
I have one thing I want to say really quick, and then Pam, I will not talk throughout the whole thing. But the one thing I want to say is that the sort of false balance is something that is personally really frustrating. And I think as an organization, we spend a lot of time talking about, because especially with the wealth of issues to cover, the idea that equal time to less accurate point of views is actually a representation of diversity is very frustrating. The other sort of thing I want to throw out there, so yes, it is a big problem, heard. The other thing I want to throw out there is that I think something that is also frustrating is thinking about the incentives sometimes for outlets. I'm not saying this is why the New York Times does things, but if you think about how often they end up having to change headlines on stuff, I think there is a certain amount of like outrage generation gets people to engage and click, and that's not a good thing. And that's not like the model that media should follow, but I do think that plays in a way that makes it even more difficult to think about objectivity and bias, because a lot of times, even if the reporters have written like a totally fine story, the sort of resulting outcry around something can be all about the headline, which is not usually in the reporter's control. But those are my two quick thoughts.
I would just add that going back to what we were talking about earlier, where you're number one, identifying with misinformation and then either reporting it or maybe combating it with more accurate information. Both sides of them like this is a great opportunity to do that second part of combating with more accurate information and kind of sharing something else. So often, for example, when we notice these things at Media Matters and we decide to write a post about it for our website and kind of call out the sort of false balance in a piece of reporting, the number one thing that we do is point to like polling or just like an overload of anecdotal evidence that shows how false that balance truly is. So I think that is a good way to sort of like attempt to pierce that bubble if you're thinking about your own individual ability to engage with like a specific piece of false balance, is to share with whoever is sharing that. Maybe an example of polling, or something else that kind of suggests like, hey, just so you know, like this viewpoint is actually incredibly rare and fringy, or in some cases, especially lately, literally racist and therefore not worth engaging with. And that is a more extreme example of where you find false balance, where one of the sides is just like, that's not an argument. So that's something that I would add. And then I also think in general, strength in numbers again. So I wonder if people hadn't spoken up right away about that Tom Cotton headline, whether the New York Times would have felt as much pressure to change it. In that specific instance, there were also, number one, a lot of Black employees with the New York Times, and then number two, a lot of allies of Black employees within the New York Times or within larger media who were standing up and responding and saying they were all actually tweeting the same thing, which is that running this put Black New York Times staffers in danger. And that's a really great example of, number one, why unions are good, but also number two, why organizing in general and kind of getting some strength in numbers is important. Because as long as we are sort of in this frame of mind as a larger media landscape where outrage works, you can use that to your advantage and have some strength in numbers to sort of force some sort of action. Because it kind of also points back to, hey, if this certain number of your viewers or your audience are all angry about this, you might lose subscriptions or lose their trust, and they might go to new places, and no more clicks or whatever sort of things are motivating them to publish things like that are super both sidey. So
yeah, one thing to add there really quick is also, as part of exactly what Pam was talking about, sharing the thing to be mad about the thing is not always the best method for drawing attention to it, especially when we know that things like outrage clicks sell. So I think that's a good example of a time where maybe, when responding to it, people didn't always share the op-ed, but they might share like a screenshot of it, or they might just be like, I'm not going to repost this because I don't want to send people to the link. But thinking about times where, we're not sharing the thing to be mad about the thing, because that gives us a little more leverage as well.
Yes, this is actually only sort of related, but I just feel the need to say it really quickly. We often will track specific hashtags also at Media Matters, And 9 times out of 10, when there's a bad hashtag, half the people that are promoting it to criticize it. So if you're criticizing something like that, it's also important to think about the words you're using and make sure that you're literally not hashtagging something that you're trying to criticize, because you're just contributing to it trending.
Good point, because I think that it's also hard to find a way to stop that from happening, right? Unless we have, which is why organizing is so important, is that we are working in coalitions and getting those counter frames and counter hashtags out to the world. So another question we got is if you have any best practices for dealing with the many locations people are getting their information. It's no longer the era, as Sarah wrote in the question, it's no longer the era our parents existed in of reading the paper and watching the evening news. How do you talk to folks about that? Knowing that it's not as though we can trust every media outlet to be 100% accurate all the time. But do you have sort of like a top 3 or 4 that you feel like you can actually like fact check because they've generally been better than others?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So like things that we would recommend being part of like a regular reading.
Right.
Interesting. I think it probably depends a little bit, just because everybody's personal like reading role, I think, varies a little depending on issues. Like I think for me, for example, like Rewire is still on my list because I'm still like very interested in sort of coverage of like reproductive rights and reproductive justice. Not that that's the only place, but I know that factors in high for me. I think it depends on sort of stories that people are interested in. Stuff that I know I am personally checking, I guess, is I like to look at Vox. I like to look at Talking Points Memo. I get a lot of news from Twitter, which, for better or worse, means a lot of sort of extra vetting on my part. But I think seeing sort of what stories are popping up a lot among people that I'm following, either for work or just generally to stay informed, helps me kind of figure out what things I need to personally do a little more research on too. So I tend to kind of read by aggregate that way as well.
Mm-hmm. I would add also that when I think of this question, I don't necessarily have specific outlets that I trust, but I do have specific reporters that I trust or writers. Mm-hmm. So I think part of it is also developing a one-sided but relationship with the people that you trust the most to be reporting things accurately. I don't trust everyone at Vox, but I trust certain people at Vox, for example. Or I don't like most of the politics and White House reporters at the New York Times, but in other segments of the New York Times, they're very good. So I think it involves like a certain level of trust, more in individuals than in the intention, because then you can kind of figure out, number one, is this a healthcare reporter that's been working on a healthcare beat for a long time and knows what they're talking about? Or is this a general reporter who used to write problematic stuff on another topic and now they're switched over to healthcare? One of these people I trust and one of them I don't trust as much. So I think it's more important to just think about it in an incremental, like person by person almost level, rather than a full outlet.
Thank you. And do you recommend creating like an authors list on Twitter to be able to get everyone together, or how do you keep track of all of these things?
I wouldn't recommend how any of anyone at Media Matters engages with the news, because it's crazy making, and I think it shouldn't be anyone's job to engage with the news as much as we do, unless you're also getting paid to do it. But I, for example, use TweetDeck, and I follow a bunch of different Twitter lists at the same time. So I follow a right-wing media Twitter list so I can see what they are saying. For a long time, my beat, in addition to local news, was also like gender-based reporting. And I wrote a lot of our content around the beginning of the Me Too movement. So I have a separate list that is like reporters who have broken big stories on Me Too, because again, I trust them. They did that really hard and intense and problematic and nuanced sort of vetting of those types of stories. So I have like a couple of different lists that I follow, and I think most people that use the TweetDeck type of approach at Media Matters do the same. I also frankly have a separate list of just my coworkers, because I know that I can trust them to evaluate things before they share them.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add, I think, yes, Twitter lists can be helpful, but also like don't do what we do in terms of the amount of stuff you follow. The caution I will give is that if you're not building a list privately, like if you're building a public list that is viewable to people, so just be conscientious of the fact of like what you're naming those things and who you're including on that list, because people, as long as it's a public list, can see that they've been added and can look at the full list.
Thank you. And so the last question we got is specific to a little bit of Media Matters research. So does your research track paths of mis or disinformation through various sites, essentially mapping how it moves from its original location to our national, regional, local media landscape? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think sometimes we do a lot of different styles of posts. And so sometimes our goal is like a very quick, like debunk, fact checked, like this was said in this outlet, here's why it is wrong, or like here's more evidence of why this is like a correct read and conservative media is running with something wrong. So there's a lot of posts that sort of work mechanically like that. We also do a style of post that we tend to call like food chains, which will track the spread of a claim from where it initially started through sort of various, various turns and twists it may take. An example of a piece of content we did recently about this is that we did, there was a conspiracy going around that donations to Black Lives Matter were actually going to the Democratic Party because they were using Act Blue, the sort of fundraising processor. And this was something that we saw start on, like Reddit, message boards like 4chan and 8chan, get spread by some conservative influencers on Twitter. And then from there, started going through like conservative media outlets and then kind of got picked up along the line. So we will do research that kind of traces those things. Other examples of stuff we might do along those lines are some of our Facebook work, looking at how a claim maybe started with like a conservative website, but then got spread through a bunch of Facebook groups that maybe were, straight news. So like the protest study I talked about, and some of our work about, we actually have some work about how this works in the context of reproductive rights too. But I think the short answer is yes, we do kind of track things like that sometimes. And usually the determinant of when we'll approach something that way is if there's a story to be told about the spread of it versus the benefit of very quickly debunking it. So sort of a big picture view versus like quickly kind of cutting off the misinformation where it's at.
Thank you. And I wanted to move us towards the end of this conversation. We have 4 minutes left by talking about how people can stay connected with Media Matters work. On our end, if you are interested in online messaging training and becoming part of Digital Defenders, I will send you our email for our next training session so you can join our online community. But Sharon and Pam, how can people follow what Media Matters does and keep in touch with you?
Well, number one is our website, mediamatters.org. And I was going to say our new website, but it's almost a year old since we did the redesign. It's just so pretty that I still call it the new website. But you can find tons of stuff there, from more data heavy studies, like talking about how Fox spent 9 hours talking about the Seattle Autonomous Zone, or really quick clips of what are they talking about on Fox today. You can find that information there, all sorts of stuff. And some of those like food chains like Sharon talked about. It's all there. We are also pretty active on Twitter, so it's at MMFA. I really like our Instagram. It's pretty new, Media Matters for the number America. And one thing I would recommend specifically on our website is that we do have a weekly email newsletter. Our colleague John writes it, and he is very punchy and fun to read, and he kind of gives a rundown of the big stories, how media is engaging with those stories, and then sort of also lists what he calls the weak and dumb, which is just like some of the most ridiculous right-wing stuff that's coming up. So you can kind of use that as one way to filter the information and get right to the point. I think in general, email newsletters are pretty big for us as well. So that is one other way to keep in touch. Did I miss anything, Sharon? We used to have a Tumblr. I don't know if we have Tumblr anymore, but it was a great Tumblr.
I don't know if we do. I think some of that content migrated to Instagram, but if the Tumblr is still there, it's good.
I'm glad that Tumblr is a relic of the past now. I still remember Zanga, so it's like there's something new every day. But I appreciate you all so much. Really am taken aback by the very engaged audience and participants, and how you are planning on bringing this back to your own lives. Lots of questions about link to recording, so that will happen after the session is over and ended. You'll get a follow-up email with some resources, the contact information, as well as the link to the recording. So I just want to say thank you all so much for your expertise. I learned a lot. I will certainly be fact checking a lot more in my personal life. So thank you. And look forward to being in touch with everyone that attended. And I hope you all have a great rest of the week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.